And I've asked folks to take a look at your faculty profile, your lab groups page, and some other materials. So they should have kind of a sense of who you are and what you do. But just to get us started, if you want to do like a really quick introduction to who you are, what your research is about.
Sure. So great to meet all of you. Hi. Ron Castellano, I started at UF in 2002. So this is it's over 20 years. I did my studies, bachelor degree in Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, and then moved to MIT, started my graduate career there. And then after joining a research laboratory, in our first essentially lab group meeting, there was an announcement that my PhD advisor would be moving to California. So this was a significant shock, but decided to move along with him. And then 4 years was spent out in La Jolla, California. After that, I did a PhD, received my PhD. Then I did a postdoctoral work in Zurich, Switzerland, and then came to UF. Started a research lab in organic chemistry, organic synthesis, physical organic chemistry. Those are kind of the broad areas of our research. And more specifically, a subfield called supramolecular chemistry. So this is really a subdiscipline of organic chemistry that's inspired by biology. And when it was originally started, it was a bunch of chemists who said, you know, biology does things magnificently. Can't we do that as chemists? And how would we do that? And could we then apply those rules and rubrics to new materials and new medicines? And so that's how that field was started. So we do research specifically in the area of organic materials, organic electronic materials, solar cell materials. We also collaborate with researchers to prepare new therapeutics, anti-cancer medication. We also make new molecules that haven't been made before, and in the process of doing that, discover all sorts of new phenomena. That's probably what we enjoy doing most. And then I think that captures pretty much everything. And we work closely with macromolecular chemists in chemistry. So these are folks that make generally polymers and look at polymer applications. So we do that from the small molecule side.
Excellent. So anybody want to get us started with a question? Yeah.
Sounds neat, right? Yeah. So I think the analogy to cooking is a reasonable one. And in many cases, there are recipes that are available to actually prepare molecules in the laboratory. And it's like cooking in the sense that if you read a recipe from a cookbook, oftentimes you'll encounter, certainly it'll be stepwise, right? But then in certain steps, they'll have you do something that you're not familiar with, unless you're pretty proficient at cooking. It's the same idea with the laboratory. So it'll say, in some cases, mix A and B. You'll be like, all right, well, I assume I just put them in the same flask, right? And that would be sufficient. But in other cases, it'll give you some verb that you're like, I have no idea what that means. So you would then have to be trained. But sort of the stepwise procedure of combining reagents or chemicals is the same as in cooking. Then you stir things, you heat them up. The problem is that unlike the cooking part, you need to sort of extract what you want from all the other stuff. And that we call purification. And it can be somewhat tedious depending on the reactions. Then you kind of fish out what you want. And once you have that, you're either done or you subject it to another series of reactions or another cooking step. So I did recently finish finally the Breaking Bad series. And so it's certainly analogous. Okay, and so sort of the rigor that was executed in that series is appropriate. I mean, that's sort of what we do as well. And there's a relationship between, let's say, purity and sort of the care you take in the individual steps. So now, as far as making new molecules, that's sort of the neat part. Like, you can do everything I described and make molecules that have been made before, and that's all well and good, especially if you want to use those molecules for different applications or different purposes that haven't been used before. So, for example, repurposing a drug molecule, which happens quite a bit. But what we do is make molecules that haven't existed before, and that's kind of the philosophical spin on, not specifically what we do. There are lots of people that do that, but that's really what captures the imagination, I think, of a lot of the graduate students that join my lab, and undergraduates too. It's like, I just made something that I'm the first one, ever, at least that's reported that, making this thing. So.
There's a question pop up in the chat from Simona. Biggest obstacle in your academic career, and how did you overcome it?
It's a great question. Okay. See, I feel like part of me wants to say that I feel my wife talking to me actually about the patriarchy at the moment. So I need to be careful how I answer this. I would say that my path has been reasonably smooth. Biggest obstacle would be, I think, moving from my undergraduate degree to a graduate program where there was a different level of academic rigor and expectation. And I think that if I had to generalize this to all of you, it's something you will encounter regardless of where you end up going from here. It could be a job, it could be another academic program, for example. But I think you get pretty comfortable in your current setting, and then you find your way there, and you tailor your program even to be, appropriate for how you kind of behave and, how you perform best. And then when you move on, it's a different employer or a different setting, and it's more competitive. In other words, the folks that have gotten to that stage are already quite good, typically. And so that was a big adjustment, I would say. So moving to MIT, that's the example that I have. This was eye-opening. So as an undergraduate, I did very well academically, and then I got to MIT, and I realized that at best I was about middle of the pack, certainly in terms of my knowledge, and not in terms of my drive, which is a good thing, but I realized that I had a lot of work to do, and that was uncomfortable. But if you work hard, then you essentially get up to speed, and then hopefully the other skills you have kind of fill in the gaps, and maybe you're ahead of the game after that. Then I moved to Europe. That was a big, more culture related adversity at that point. Remember my first 2 weeks, I thought I was having like a panic attack, thinking that I couldn't possibly be here, right? I just felt homesick, but then pushed through that, and then it was all fine. And then starting a lab here, at each stage essentially is you're just confronted with all sorts of new challenges, and you're hoping that you've been armed with the resources up to that point to navigate them. That's all. And so you should embrace those challenges, but recognize you're not going to be completely settled. Definitely be uncomfortable, and I think that's okay. Yeah.
Was there a specific experience where you realized, or rather that made you realize you wanted to continue a career in chemistry or establishment?
Yeah, I think it's cliche. I've heard this over and over, but it has to do with organic chemistry, and I was a biology major in, I guess it goes back to high school, where my program, I couldn't take like the equivalent of chemistry 2. This is a long time ago, by the way, but I couldn't take chemistry 2 and biology 2 because they were at the same time, which sounds ridiculous, but so I had to choose one. So I chose biology and it was fine. So then because of that, when I got to college, I'm like, oh, I should be a biology major because I had seen more of it. I mean, you're familiar with these logic threads that seem reasonable, but they're really not, right? So I get into college and I'm like, I really don't like biology. And I take organic chemistry. I'm like, this is great. And I saw something there that I hadn't appreciated from high school. Now, many of you take some organic chemistry before you even get to college, but at that point, it was definitely eye-opening. And then I learned you can do research, in a research lab. So those two combined, the course and the research, and I immediately changed my major, and then that was it. So I knew chemistry was what I wanted to do, but I didn't know whether it was going to be in the academic sector or industry. I guess that decision came later, and it's one I reflect on a lot. And I love academia, but yeah, and we could talk about that. But definitely, I would like the opportunity to do it again differently and just then compare. So I don't have that opportunity, but yeah. But that's how I got into chemistry. One class, essentially.
Another question in the chat. You kind of already just answered the first part, but the second part is from Shing. How do you feel about publishing research, academic publishing, that whole process?
Well, lots of responses. It's required. I enjoy writing. I'm good at writing. So this is important. If anything you have to do involves writing, but you find it arduous, and if that's because you haven't done it very much, or you feel that you don't do it very well, then that makes that even worse. So in what I do, I have to write a lot, and I do like to do that. What I don't like is the idea of, again, having to publish to satisfy different requirements. So, and there are a lot of them. One is that the students who have done the research, need certain products in order to move on or advance in their careers. So they need publications. Funding agencies require you to have products associated with the money that they've provided you, which may be coming from the taxpayer. So your sort of job promotion trajectory is related to these products as well. At the end, sometimes you forget that actually science, in my case, is important too. And so what is the science? What are we doing for humanity, and how should we kind of disseminate that? So all of this gets jumbled together, but it's very easy to get in this race for trying to publish too much, too often, or wherever you can, and I think that's the downside. So I don't know if I answered that, but I have a lot of emotions when it comes to publishing. We tend to try and be a bit selective about where we publish and why.
Did you like the process of owning a lab, like having a lab versus just being a part of it? Like which one? Well, I would think that you find owning a lab preferable, but like, how do you feel about like the transition from those two? And for your lab, what do you think your like research is going to go from like what you currently are doing?
Okay. So owning a lab versus sort of being in a lab. for me, it could only be owning. And I think that a lot of you will find this to be true as well. You probably already know whether you're good with working for someone or would prefer to work for yourself. And that starts coming through in your first jobs that you've had and your relationships with bosses, for example, and whether you find yourself inclined to be like, it's a good idea. I like how we're doing things here, but I think we could do it better this way. If you're one of those people, then eventually over time, it gets harder, I think, to work for someone, unless they're what you consider to be a good boss. So for me, that's always been the case. Always wanted to do my own thing. And so that owning my own lab is the only way to go. Now, along with that comes a lot of responsibility, right? And some of what I have to do in that role is not what I'm super thrilled with. Okay, I like the science, I like mentoring, but there's a lot of overhead. Our research in the future, I always think that the best is yet to come, probably from our lab. And I think it's going to be in the biomedical sector, to be honest. So organic chemistry is so important in pushing new drugs forward. And physical organic chemistry, what we do thinking about how molecules behave and how they interact is also important for drug discovery. And UF now, it's got such fabulous resources and, in this area that I think that's where we'll be headed. Kind of drifting away from probably materials and moving more toward medicine.
I also like US database of the research. But like I found out like especially in bio and medicine field, there's a lot of like scientific terms that I don't understand. And I wonder like if this like qualifies me like enough to join the lab.
Good question. So if you're unfamiliar with even the research or some of the terminology or the language, right, you're still set up to join a lab, and of course. And a lot of that, what you're describing, is on the job training. So I think that, and this is true even for, if I fast forward to graduate students from my lab who have obtained their PhDs and thinking about why they've been hired by certain companies, let's say. And those reasons have oftentimes very little to do with their PhD training in the sense of what research they've done. And this always surprises me. So when I started teaching here and had a lab, I was thinking that, well, my students are going to be exposed to these specific things, and then companies are really going to want these folks as employees. But it turns out that they're hired because they can communicate, they can write well, they can work in a team, they're familiar with multidisciplinary science, all these very general things, right? And so going to what you're saying, you can join any lab, right? If you're excited and motivated and interested. And then it's the lab's responsibility through that environment to teach you about the specifics. So you should look broadly when you're thinking about undergraduate research in particular, and think about the environment probably first, and also something that you could imagine yourself being interested in doing. And then next, I would say don't follow your peers necessarily and just do what they do. Ton of labs on campus for you.
Kind of related question from the pre-submitted, Daniel Marini asks, in your experience, what are some common misconceptions or challenges that undergraduates may encounter when trying to enter the world of research, and how can they overcome those challenges?
Yeah, there are definitely challenges. Misconceptions, I'm not sure. One could be that you need to have knowledge before you join a lab, and that's really not the spirit of doing it at all. I think the challenges really are finding a lab in the first place and actually getting responses from faculty oftentimes is difficult. So I hear stories of students that, kind of send out, broadcast a bunch of emails to labs and don't hear anything. So I think that one approach there would be to identify someone in a department that maybe through a course that you've had, and see if they can't help you to identify labs that might be eligible. And what I mean by that is, for example, in chemistry, maybe there are 45 tenure track faculty, but that doesn't mean that there are 45 laboratories that are well suited for undergraduates. Some don't host undergraduates. Other folks are not as research active as others. And so if you talk to me, then I can kind of guide you a bit. And I'd also encourage you to look at websites. And I feel that a lab that finds undergraduate research and education important is going to have an updated website with a list of undergraduates who have been in the lab or who are in the lab currently. And that's sort of the place you would want to go, as opposed to one that hasn't been updated in the last 10 years. Now, it's a small thing, but managing websites now isn't really that hard. I haven't used AI to do it. I just do it the old-fashioned way, but it takes me about 10 minutes a month to kind of make sure all the group members have their photo of it, right? So I think if I can do that, it's saying, come join us, or at least reach out, and I respond to all my emails too. So I think that finding an ally in a department or program is useful. If that answers that question. Yeah.
What would you say like your day-to-day life is? Like, is it mostly lab focus? Is it mostly in your office? Like, what do you do?
It's entirely in my office. It hasn't been in the lab in a very long time. Big change. So this is also a story you'll hear over and over, that sort of what I have to do day to day is very much removed from what I was trained to do. And that's especially true if you've been in a particular position for a long time. So over 20 years now, I do a lot of things that have little to do with research, right? That's really all I would like to do. Once in a while, I get to spend a whole day, usually it's in preparation for writing a proposal or something, that get to spend a whole day immersed in the literature and thinking about new ideas. And that brings me back all the way to even as a late stage undergraduate, certainly graduate school, when I was doing that. That's a very comfortable feeling. But I don't get to do it very often. So I can't really describe all the little things that go on during the day, but the list, especially for undergraduates, I think you have a sense that there's a lot of those, whatever they are, those distracting things. But if you saw the list, you'd be surprised, I think, what comes in during the day that things have to be attended to. The other part, which I should mention, which is relevant to all of you, is letters of recommendation. This comes up a lot, and as you teach undergraduates, which I do, and also I've had a lot of students come through my lab, this becomes a very big part of what I do. And it's surprisingly large, and I take this very seriously, but it takes a lot of time. And so I don't think a week goes by where I don't get a couple requests at all stages, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's very much it's like running a small business. There's the accounting, there's the finances, there's the HR, right? Which I'm responsible for my own lab.
I would think like you would be doing research every day.
Yeah,
So that's completely eye-opening.
yeah, I'm advising, right,
Yeah.
research, but it's not, but there are many days where I don't even think about what we're doing in the lab because I'm distracted by,
Keeping the lab running.
Yeah.
The lights on, I think.
right?
Thank you.
It's like the pipettes are cheaper from this vendor, right? All the way through to, you know, the some undergraduate letter of recommendation for some award, right? I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but it's due in 2 days. Can we do it? Right, this sort of
Yeah.
thing, right? And then the day's gone. Yeah, so it's amazing, but I like that. I mean, I like that it's very different. But I do miss doing what I was trained to do. Yeah, fair question. I'm a little selective because I can be. There are so many undergraduates that are interested in research. So typically they know me from classes, but not necessarily. So I'll give you a couple things that are required for my lab. One is don't tend to bring on board students who are in their senior year. So usually it's junior at the latest and freshman at the earliest, or first year. Okay. And the reason is that there's the onboarding process, you know, kind of learning to cook, use the Walter White expression, takes time and effort from kind of the lab staff. So you might be paired with a graduate student who's doing their own work and they're trying to kind of coach you up in perspective. It takes a semester or two to get proficient enough to be independent. And so I like to have that opportunity for someone to stay at least 2 years in our lab, and some stay 3 or even 4. And so I think that's probably number one. And number two would be, I do check academics and some track record of good performance in chemistry is useful. Don't require students to have taken organic chemistry necessarily. I used to do that, but then I stopped because I found that, again, a lot of enrolling students have exposure to organic chemistry, for example, from elsewhere, or even in general chemistry. So, and then the other thing is sort of the time you can invest is important, not only semester to semester, but within the semester. That is, if you say, well, you know, I got 4 hours a week, it's just not enough for what we do. So it's usually the equivalent of 2 credit hours would be the minimum. And so those are the logistics. And so I usually clarify that with the student right away. And then we move on to we meet. And then that's the second hurdle. So if we could sit and chat, usually in the first few minutes, I can tell if this is going to work. And I can't think of really a case where it's been like a rejection on that, but I need to think about the student fitting into the environment that we have. And honestly, you know, a student would have to be really offensive to be disqualified, right? Like swearing at me. But I take that the environment part very seriously. And again, the reason is I'm not in the lab, right? So this isn't about me interacting with the student, it's about my group. So I'm the filter for that, because then the next stage is like, so I have this great undergrad who wants to do research. You'd be a great mentor for them. Are you willing to do that? And when I ask, they assume that, you know, the student's been vetted by me. So that's how we do it. But every lab is a bit different.
Another pre-written question from Joseph and Jody. you ever have to present your findings to someone with limited knowledge of the field? And how can you make your findings understandable to someone with limited knowledge?
I try not to do that. It's very hard. And I think it is the hardest thing that I've had to do scientifically. I'll give you an example. So I did give a talk at a retirement home here in Gainesville many years ago. And I thought this would be a nice outreach opportunity. Except I went into it not thinking about the audience very much. And so I gave a talk. And in typical fashion, I'll tell you how this works for most faculty in that situation. You're like, well, okay, the deadline's gonna have to give this talk, but I don't want to make like an entirely new talk. I'm just gonna patch it together. I have slides from here and there, and I'll try and generalize it through my words and actions. So I tried to do that. And it was horrible. So horrible that, I mean, folks were nodding their heads and all, but one person came up to me after this and was just angry. And was like, that was terrible. He said, you know, I haven't had chemistry in 45 years, and you know, your talk expected me to know all this stuff. And I'm thinking in my mind, you know, no, that's not true. I explained it well, but it was impenetrable to the layperson. So that was a valuable lesson. I was never invited back. Even though I tried to go back, actually, about a decade later, and I never got a response. So that, and I've given other talks where I've mismanaged it in one way or the other. And I think that, so to the question, it's hard to do. It takes a lot of effort. I think to do it properly, you need to have a completely blank slate and think about it differently. And usually I am a procrastinator. I don't leave enough time typically to do that. So but it is something I need to work on. I've thought about it a lot. And that's why I went back, because I'm like, I need this opportunity. I need to do this well one time to show myself that I can do it. But obviously it's much easier to speak to folks familiar with some science. And comes up at Thanksgiving, comes up in the holidays, right, with family, and they're like, oh, what are you working on in the lab? And I'm like, can you pass the gravy, please? Because you only have about 10 to 15 seconds with whoever asked the question to hook them in. This is what I've found. And if you blow it, they're asking for the gravy, right? So it's something important for any of you, whatever you do, to have, they call it, you know, the elevator pitch or the 3-minute whatever. 3 minutes is actually way too long. I've never had that attention span with my father-in-law, for example. So it's more like, really, it's seconds. And the way your mannerisms, I think, are important. If you already seem, which would be my, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this, I already know where this is going to go, then I don't think they're interested anymore. So it's a good question.
Go to another question from the sheet. Omar Al-Raza asks, after your first publication, you must have felt very happy. How do you repeat that same feeling when you're publishing a lot of successive work? Is it still as fulfilling as the first time?
So it's definitely different in that the first publications were mine and for me and related to my career and trajectory. And so I knew that, and they were a lot of work and it was hard and you had never done that before and you weren't sure if you could do it. But then the publication becomes about someone else, and that's exciting. So that's really what I like, is the graduate student, the undergraduate involved in the work that's getting their first paper. This is really what's motivating. I still enjoy having publications myself, but I think it's really more about them at this point and satisfying all the other requirements, but it's definitely less about me.
Could you speak a little bit about your time in Switzerland?
Sure, yeah, it was great. So I encourage everyone to go abroad if you can at some stage of your career while you still have, I'd say, maybe more limited obligations. It's not true for everyone, but for me, it was good timing. The trajectory, sort of the academic trajectory historically has been one, at least in the United States, where you get your PhD and then you would do a postdoc. And this is a whole different discussion point now, but at the time you would do a postdoc typically in the United States, and then you would get a job also in the United States. So to go abroad for any component traditionally made it a little more difficult to get a position here. Not really so well founded even then, but certainly not now, because science, other disciplines are so multinational. But I had said to myself, I wanted to go abroad. And then I found a lab that was a good one, and then I justified doing it in the sense that I was going to a place that was well-known, great school in Switzerland, and I should be okay. And then even my PhD advisor said, you know, listen, after this postdoc, you're probably gonna have to do another one back in the US when you're done. And it's like, I'm not doing it. That's ridiculous. So I didn't do that. Anyway, in Zurich, I mean, culture was great. The exchange rate at the time I was there was very favorable. Now I think it'd be cost prohibitive for most people. But just being exposed to different people from all over Europe and mostly Europe, I would say. But I worked in a lab that had many countries represented, and just working in a different climate, a different academic system, having to learn, if that was super helpful. But I think in terms of communication, that was the biggest improvement. So it was coming back here and then being able to talk to people from different countries in a certain way that, you know, many people picked up on that right away. I'd be talking to someone from around the world, be like, oh, I can understand you very well, or, you know, thank you for, and I think it was because of that experience. So yeah, do it if you can. Yeah.
I talked to a graduate student about the courses, and they recommended if you want to go to graduate school, you have to do coding in undergrad, like trying to take more classes related to that. So is there any skills that are difficult to learn but will help you succeed in research?
I think so. I can answer that from the chemistry side, but it would be hard to answer more generally. I think that if you're inclined to go into any research discipline, then having any research exposure is great. Because one of the issues is you not knowing whether that really appeals to you. It's like the idea sounds great, but then once you get into that environment, all of a sudden you're like, yeah, no, I don't like this. But so knowing that earlier rather than later is good. On the chemistry side, again, we're finding students that have coursework exposure that is advanced, I mean, quite honestly, and that's helpful. But it doesn't mean that they're exempt then necessarily from similar coursework at the graduate level, I would say. So we're pretty cautious about that. And I guess it's ego in some sense that we would claim that we could teach that better than what what they had, right? Which, so there's a little bit of that, but there's also the idea that our curriculum is tailored for, let's say there's a sequence of courses and we know what's offered in the first one that'll prepare you for the second one, whereas, maybe what you had before doesn't have all the components. But I think just follow your interests, and if you're interested in more advanced coursework as an undergraduate toward a graduate degree, and if your schedule allows it, and if the financing is right, I know that sometimes it's not. You have to take a graduate course, it can be expensive, but I would suggest,
So my question is, so chemistry, majoring in chemistry is so broad and there's so many different fields you could try to find a career in. So my question is just, how did you know kind of what you wanted to find a job in?
Good question. I think that, again, at the time that I made that decision, there were far fewer advertised possibilities. So it was more in the traditional disciplines at that point. And going back to the decision between academia and industry, it was fairly clear cut. The industries that I might be looking to go to and what I would be doing there versus an academic job. Now I think you can use, an advanced degree in science to do all sorts of interesting things. So, I mentioned that I like writing. I mean, I think I could have easily had a career in some sort of publishing or editing, but it wasn't appreciated at that time. So I think that, and what I was saying about my students and the basis upon which they're hired is not really what they did. It's what they learned beyond the hood. Okay. So yeah, I just think broadly, but still, if you're passionate about what you're doing, then you're going to find a way forward.
Follow up to your time and your interest in general, like you working in different research labs throughout your career, are there any qualities or traits that you noticed in those labs that you wanted to emulate in your own when you opened up your own?
Yeah, that tends to come a little bit from the advisor that you had, as well as maybe some of the more senior folks that you might work with. So starting at the advisor level, it's important to choose an environment where when you're going into research that has someone there that you think is a good person. Just generally. So that helped. My PhD advisor and my postdoctoral advisor, I kind of combined portions of both of their approaches in my own. But at the same time, I still tell people you have to be true to yourself when you're in these roles. And I tell my current graduate students that as well. So I'm not trying to be different with them than I would be with, the way I'm talking to you here is this is our group meeting, right? So, and that's the best way, I think. So I don't need to turn a switch to become someone else. And I can sleep comfortably at night, knowing that I've given the best advice I can or something like that. So I have taken strategic lessons, I guess, from those mentors and senior people in the lab. So when I was a graduate student, I got to work with people who went off to become academics, great programs, and some famous ones. But at the time they weren't, we were just doing our thing together, but I learned a lot from them. So opportunities everywhere you go.
A question here from Sophie Benson. Do you still come across things in research that surprise you, or at this point in your career are things becoming more predictable?
We encounter surprises all the time and make a career out of it. I think a lot of academics, research-based academics do the same. So especially, again, we make molecules, right? So in the course of doing that, we always make molecules we didn't intend to make. And from those, we discover all sorts of new things. So that happens all the time. At the same time, I'm less surprised by the challenges that students face. Right? This is true in the classroom or in the lab. Right? So all of you are the same age to me that you always were, right? But I'm getting older, and so I've seen a lot of the things already. And so that's a challenge for me to be responsive in a useful way. Because it's easy for me to be like, yes, I know, I've seen it before, right? But so that doesn't, but it helps me to kind of let students anticipate what the problems might be, especially in the coursework, but even in the lab to some extent.
For your lab, for your research there, what's been the most interesting finding that you have, the finding that you find is interesting?
I think that probably, so we work with a pharmacologist on campus. So story is essentially that, and maybe there's a message here for all of you, that when I first got to UF, I wanted to meet some people, and I joined a literature group, essentially. So it's a group of faculty that got together and discussed cancer literature, and this is not my area. And so I thought that would be a neat way to learn something new, but also then again meet potential collaborators. So I met someone during that meeting. So that's 2 years after I got here, and the first year that he was here. And we hit it off. It was like, oh, yeah. We just got along really well. Didn't have any research to do, but I think from that interaction, we were inclined to find things to do together if we could. So fast forward many years, that's when he came to us with an interesting class of organic molecules that showed interesting anti-cancer properties in breast cancer cell lines. And we started, that was 2014, we started a collaboration at that point. It goes to the current day, lots of grants, and wrote some papers, and some PhD theses came out of this work. So I think that kind of discovery, but it's really commenting more on the human aspects than anything. But back to sort of meeting people and building relationships. True also for my students with a PhD going off into the job market, the relationships are critical, more so now than they ever were. I mean, when I did this, I didn't really know anyone and didn't have to. People were just looking at my CV, be like, oh yeah, it looks good. But now it's almost everything who you know. It helps, right? LinkedIn. I started using that 3 years ago. I mean, I had an account, but I never did anything. And then once I realized that everyone is on that, and my students are all using that as a tool. So then I set out to get as many connections as I possibly could. Probably not that many relative to others, but I was, think about all the students I've interacted with over the years as a faculty member. Everyone I was writing, I don't know what they were thinking, but it's like former PhD students all the way back, like 18 years worth. I'm like, connect. They're all at companies now, or not all of them, but a lot of them. I figured this is a great untapped resource.
Yeah.
And that's been valuable. So one of my students just recently who had someone she knew at Boeing in New Orleans, and a job without me. I mean, I didn't write any letters. And that, it's, right, I didn't have to, Boeing didn't say, hey, tell me about Susan. Just got it on their own. I have other students that have done that too. They get their own job.
Yeah,
Just bonkers, because when I was a student, there was no path forward other than through my advisors,
right.
right? And now it's not the case.
On that note, I think we're at time. We'll have to end, but thank you so much
Sure.
for sharing your time, your wisdom, your advice.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.